Yeah, so the process and the principles of this. The way we do it is that we keep the threat models in the repos. And why? Because that way it's very close to the developers, and that way it's close to the code. So the developers approach the threat model in their own environment, and the threat model lives next to the code that it analyzes. So therefore, it's just better at bridging that gap that I talked about. Also, if we approach a threat model as code, the version systeming comes into place. And this is how we can easily track not only the changes to a threat model, but what is happening to our application and the evolution to the application itself. Because as you all know, a lot of times by having a threat modeling session, we actually establish the architecture of the application, because a lot of times the devs themselves are not really sure about the architecture. They're not really sure about the flows. There's some gaps in the knowledge. So by establishing a threat modeling session, a lot of facts get panned out, and you can create a really good document, and that describes not only the security architecture, but the whole architecture per se. So when you have a new iteration of that threat model, if you make a little change to your application, if you introduce a small feature, you also introduce this change to the threat model, and you create that as a pull request into your existing threat model. So when you check into that pull request, you can see the differences, and that's how you track the whole evolution of the threat model and the application itself. And this is why I'm an advocate of doing much more smaller threat models than a big one. You can create a big one that will comprehend the whole application, but then every other subsequent threat model that will just be addressing one part of the application, also depending on the complexity of the application itself, that again can be just another pull request that just goes into the big threat model and complements it. So you don't have this huge, threatening chunk of data where you can't really understand what's happening. And so that's also an option to do separate threat models as well. And you can do it whether in the actual repo where the code is, or you can do it in a separate threat modeling repo. It's kind of like depends on the complexity of the application itself, because a lot of times there's not a lot of repos, so you can just put in every repo its own threat model. But sometimes if a threat model comprehends multiple repos across the whole application, then you probably want to have a separate threat modeling repo. Right, so moving on. So as I said, why? Because it scales. Once you have a few threat models that you've done of your application, every other subsequent threat model will be easier, and you won't have to go through everything again, especially if you log the flows, if you log the facts, then every single iteration of the threat model will be easier and easier. And then you won't have to keep going back to the beginning, but you just create little pull requests on the original threat model that will show your change.